Mark was an 8-year-old boy who lived in a small, bustling part of London. His apartment was small, but it had a big window where he spent a lot of his time. Mark loved sitting there because it gave him the perfect view of the street below, where people passed by with shopping bags, bicycles, and even sometimes dogs wagging their tails. But his favorite days were when the Royal Guards marched through the city on their way to special events. If you love heartwarming and inspiring stories like Mark's, make sure to subscribe to Stargem for more tales that bring joy and courage to your day. Don't forget to click the notification button so you never miss a story that sparks hope and makes you smile. The Royal Guards were everything Mark admired: strong, proud, and perfectly in sync. Their red coats and tall black hats made them look like heroes from the fairy tales his mother used to read to him. They didn't just march, they moved with such precision and grace that it felt like they were a part of something magical. Every time he saw them, Mark's heart would race with excitement. He would clap and cheer from his window, imagining himself walking alongside them, holding his head high like a real soldier. But there was one thing Mark couldn't ignore. His legs didn't work the way other children's did. Mark had a condition that made it hard for him to walk, and he needed a wheelchair to get around. He often looked at his reflection in the window, imagining himself in a bright red coat and a tall black hat. Deep down, he worried that someone like him could never be a royal guard. People in his neighborhood were kind, but sometimes the kids at the park teased him, saying, "You can't even march. How could you ever be a soldier?" Those words stayed with Mark, making his dream feel even farther away. One rainy afternoon, as he sat by the window watching droplets slide down the glass, his mother came over and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Mark," she said, "what's on your mind?" He hesitated before answering. "I want to be like the Royal Guards, Mama. But I can't march like they do." His mother knelt beside him, looking into his eyes with a warmth that made him feel a little stronger. "You have the heart of a royal guard, my son. It's not just about marching. It's about courage and kindness. You have both." Her words filled him with a small flicker of hope. "Do you think I could ever meet them?" he asked. His mother smiled. "Why don't you write a letter to the king? Tell him your dream. Sometimes sharing your heart can make incredible things happen." Mark's eyes lit up. A letter to the king. It sounded impossible, but his mother's confidence made him believe it might just work. That evening, with his mother sitting beside him, he carefully wrote down his thoughts on a piece of lined paper. His handwriting was wobbly, but his words were filled with determination. "Dear King of England, my name is Mark, and I am 8 years old. I live in London, and I love watching the Royal Guards. They are my heroes. I dream of being one of them one day. I know I cannot march like they do because I use a wheelchair, but my heart is as brave as theirs. If I could meet the Royal Guards, it would make me the happiest boy in the world. Thank you for reading my letter. Your friend, Mark." When he finished, his mother kissed his forehead. "This is beautiful," she said. "Let's make sure it gets to the palace." The next morning, they gave the letter to the postman, a friendly man with a cheerful smile and a bright yellow bag slung over his shoulder. Mark handed it to him like it was the most precious treasure in the world. "Don't worry," the postman said. "I'll make sure this reaches the king." Mark's heart soared with excitement. Every day after that, he waited by the window, imagining the king reading his letter. In his mind, he pictured the king smiling and calling for the Royal Guards, saying, "Let's meet this brave boy." He dreamed of hearing a knock on the door and seeing the guards in their shining uniforms, ready to surprise him. But days passed, and no reply came. Mark's excitement began to fade. His mother tried to cheer him up, saying, "Sometimes these things take time, Mark. Be patient." What they didn't know was that the postman had accidentally dropped the letter during a heavy rainstorm. It had slipped out of his bag and into a gutter, where the water swept it away. The letter, soaked and smudged, was carried far from its destination. It never made it to the palace. As more days went by, Mark's hope turned to sadness. He stopped looking out the window as often and didn't talk about the royal guards anymore. His mother saw the light in his eyes dim, and it broke her heart. One evening, as Mark stared at his favorite toy soldier on his bedside table, he whispered, "I guess the king doesn't care about boys like me." His mother hugged him tightly, her heart aching. "Never think that, Mark. Sometimes dreams take unexpected paths. You must never lose faith in your own bravery." Though her words were kind, Mark felt like his dream had slipped away, just like his letter in the rain. Little did he know, his story was only beginning, and an incredible surprise was on its way. It was a crisp morning near Buckingham Palace, and Captain James, a tall and kind-hearted royal guard, was patrolling the grounds as usual. James had served in the royal guards for many years, but he had always believed that being the guard was more than just wearing a fine uniform or standing at attention. To him, being a guard meant serving not just the king, but the people too. He always kept an eye out for anything unusual during his rounds, whether it was a child waving excitedly or an elderly person needing help. As James walked along the edge of the palace grounds, his polished black boots splashed through a puddle left by last night's rain. Something stuck to the bottom of his boot. He bent down and peeled off what looked like a soggy piece of paper. The edges were torn, and the ink was smudged, but James noticed there was writing on it. Curious, he held the paper up to the light and began to read. Though parts of the letter were hard to make out, James could still understand the main message. It was written by a boy named Mark. The letter described how much he admired the royal guards and dreamed of meeting them one day. James read the words carefully, his heart softening with each line. The sentence that struck him the most was, "I may not march like the guards, but my heart is as brave as theirs." James stood there for a moment, holding the damp letter, feeling something stir inside him. This wasn't just any letter. It was a child's dream written with so much hope and courage. He couldn't just ignore it. That afternoon, when James returned to the guards' quarters, he shared the letter with his fellow guards. Some of them laughed, shaking their heads. "It's a sweet story," one guard said, "but the king won't bother with a child's wish. He has more important things to do." Another guard added, "We're not allowed to take on personal missions. We have strict duties to follow, Captain. You know that." James felt torn. He respected the rules, but he couldn't forget the letter. "This boy isn't asking for much," James argued. "He just wants to meet us. Imagine what it would mean to him. Isn't that part of what we stand for? Honor and kindness." But the other guards weren't convinced. "We're here to protect the king, not grant wishes," one of them said firmly. James felt his frustration grow. He looked around the room, hoping someone would understand. "This boy has a brave heart. He sees us as heroes. If we ignore this, what does that make us?" Though a few of the younger guards nodded in agreement, most of them dismissed the idea and returned to their duties. James was left standing alone, holding the crumpled letter. Little did James know, the king himself had been passing by the corridor outside the room. The king, known for his stern and reserved nature, often moved silently through the palace, observing everything without saying much. He had overheard the guards' conversation and stopped to listen when he heard James talking about Mark's letter. The king stood quietly, hidden behind the doorframe, as the guards debated whether or not to help the boy. His face remained expressionless, and he said nothing. When the conversation ended, the king continued on his way, his long robe sweeping the floor as he walked. Back in the quarters, James sat at his desk, staring at the letter. He knew the risks of going against protocol, but he couldn't shake the thought of Mark sitting by his window, waiting for a reply that might never come. James made a decision then and there. He would find a way to help Mark, even if it meant stepping out of line. The next day, James gathered a few trusted guards who he knew shared his sense of duty and compassion. He showed them the letter and explained his plan. Though hesitant at first, they eventually agreed to join him. Together, they began to prepare for what would be a secret mission, one that could bring a child's dream to life. Meanwhile, the king, though silent, had not forgotten the conversation he overheard. Known for his strictness, no one could predict what he was thinking. The guards had no idea whether he approved of their actions or if they were risking their positions by going through with their plan. James didn't know how the story would end, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let Mark's bravery go unnoticed. As he tucked the letter safely into his pocket, he whispered to himself, "Every dream deserves a chance." Captain James couldn't stop thinking about Mark's letter. The words written by the young boy had touched him deeply, and he knew he had to act. Breaking the rules wasn't something he did lightly, but he believed some rules were worth bending if it meant bringing joy to a child with such a brave heart. James approached a few of his most trusted fellow guards. He explained Mark's story and shared his idea. They would organize a small parade right on Mark Street. The goal was to bring the royal guards to Mark, to let him see and meet his heroes without leaving his home. The guards were surprised at first, but as James spoke, they saw how much this meant to him and to Mark. One of the guards, Thomas, nodded. "If this boy can dream so big, then we can march for him. Count me in." Another guard, Peter, frowned. "You know the risks, Captain. If the king finds out, we could lose our positions." "I know," James replied, his voice steady. "But this isn't about breaking rules. It's about doing what's right. Mark believes in us. Let's show him he's right to believe." In the end, 3 guards joined James. Together, they began planning the surprise. They would wear their full uniforms and perform a short parade in front of Mark's home. James even decided to bring a small ceremonial medal to give to Mark, a symbol of the bravery they all saw in him. However, the plan wasn't easy to execute. As they prepared, unexpected problems arose. First, during their practice session, one of the ceremonial drums broke. The sound was essential for the parade, and without it, something felt missing. The guards scrambled to find a replacement, but time was running out. Then, on the night before the big day, the sky darkened and heavy rain poured down, threatening to cancel everything. James's heart sank as he stood by the window of his quarters, watching the rain. Peter walked in and said, "Maybe this is a sign we should call it off." But James shook his head. "We promised. We'll find a way, rain or not. This isn't just about duty. It's about heart." The next morning, the rain had lightened to a drizzle. The guards decided to move forward with the plan. They snuck out of the palace early, carrying their uniforms and instruments. They avoided the main gates, slipping through a quieter exit to avoid being noticed by their commanding officer. Suspense built as the guards marched toward Mark's neighborhood. Each step felt heavier, with the risk they were taking. What if someone reported them? What if the king found out before they could finish? None of them spoke these worries aloud, but the tension was clear on their faces. When they finally reached Mark's Street, they found the neighbors already outside, curious about what was happening. The guards quickly got into formation, their red coats bright against the gray skies. James looked toward Mark's window and saw the boy peeking out, his eyes wide with wonder. "Let's do this," James whispered to his team. As the guards began their parade, the sound of the drum echoed through the street, and Mark's face lit up with pure joy. Whatever risks they had taken suddenly felt worth it. Little did they know, the king was already aware of their actions and watching from afar. It was an ordinary morning for Mark, or so he thought. He was sitting by the window, watching the rain from the night before glisten on the street. Suddenly, a distant sound caught his attention. It was faint at first, soft drums, and the sharp blare of trumpets. His heart raced, As the sound grew louder, clearer, he turned to his mother, his eyes wide with excitement. "Mom, what's that sound?" he asked. His mother, curious as well, peered outside. What she saw made her gasp. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I think you need to see this for yourself." She carefully wheeled Mark outside. As soon as they emerged from their small apartment building, Mark's jaw dropped. Marching down his very street, in perfect formation, were the Royal Guards. Their bright red coats and tall black hats gleamed in the soft morning light. The rhythmic beat of their drums echoed through the neighborhood, and the majestic sound of their trumpets filled the air. For a moment, Mark couldn't believe his eyes. The Royal Guards were here, right in front of him. He blinked, then grinned, his face lighting up like never before. The neighbors, hearing the commotion, quickly gathered along the street, clapping and cheering as the guards performed. Children pointed and waved, while adults whispered in amazement, wondering why the Royal Guards had come to their humble neighborhood. But Mark knew. Deep in his heart, he knew this was for him. His letter hadn't been forgotten after all. As the guards reached Mark, they stopped marching. Captain James, leading the group, stepped forward. He knelt down to Mark's level, holding a small box in his hands. Mark's eyes widened as James opened it to reveal a shiny ceremonial medal. "Mark," James said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "your letter found its way to us. In it, you said your heart was as brave as any guard's. We've come here today to tell you that you're right. Your courage inspires us all. You may not march with your feet, but you lead with your heart, and that is the true mark of a Royal Guard." He gently placed the medal in Mark's hands. For a moment, Mark was speechless. His mother stood behind him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you for making his dream come true." Mark looked at the medal, then at Captain James, and finally at the guards standing tall behind him. "This is the best day of my life," he said softly, his voice full of awe. The crowd erupted in applause, celebrating the moment with cheers and laughter. Mark's neighbors were overjoyed to see him so happy, and the guards stood proudly, knowing they had made a difference. But then, just as the applause began to settle, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. All heads turned to see a royal carriage approaching, its golden trim gleaming in the sunlight. The guards froze, their expressions shifting from joy to worry. The king had arrived. Captain James quickly stood up, adjusting his posture as the carriage came to a halt. The king stepped out, his regal presence commanding silence from the crowd. He walked slowly, his sharp eyes surveying the scene. The guards held their breath, fearing they might be reprimanded for acting without permission. The king stopped in front of Mark, who stared up at him in awe. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, to everyone's surprise, the king smiled, a warm, genuine smile that softened his usually stern face. He bent down slightly to look at Mark and said, "Young man, it takes great courage to dream, as big as you do. And it takes even greater courage to break the rules for the right reasons. Today my guards have shown me what true bravery looks like." The king turned to Captain James. "You acted with heart and kindness, which is what this kingdom should stand for. You have my gratitude." James and the other guards exhaled, relief washing over them. The crowd cheered again, this time louder than before. Mark couldn't stop smiling, clutching his medal tightly. The king straightened and addressed the crowd. "Let this day be a reminder that bravery comes in many forms, and let us celebrate those who inspire us, no matter their age or circumstance." As the parade concluded, the king invited Mark and his mother to visit Buckingham Palace for a special tour. Mark's dream had not only come true, but had grown into something far beyond his imagination. And now, to those of you reading this incredible story, remember that kindness and courage can change lives. If you are inspired by Mark's journey, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. And click the notification button to make sure you never miss a story that brings light and hope to the world. Let's spread these stories far and wide, one click at a time. The parade might have ended, but for Mark, it was only the beginning of something extraordinary. After the king's heartfelt words, he made an announcement that left everyone stunned and inspired. Today, the king declared, standing tall in front of the gathered crowd, "I name Mark an honorary member of the Royal Guards. His bravery, determination, and spirit are what this kingdom stands for." The crowd cheered loudly, clapping and celebrating this monumental moment. Mark's eyes grew wide with amazement, and his mother covered her mouth in disbelief, tears streaming down her face. But that's not all. The king continued. Starting today, the Royal Guards will visit children across the kingdom who show extraordinary courage. These visits will remind us all that bravery comes in many forms and should be celebrated. The cheers grew even louder. Captain James and his fellow guards stood tall and proud, knowing their risky decision had created something far greater than they could have imagined. The king then turned to Mark and his mother. "As our honorary guard, you and your family are invited to Buckingham Palace for a special tour. I want you to see where these heroes stand and inspire us all." Mark, holding the ceremonial medal tightly, could barely find the words. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for making me feel like I belong." In the days that followed, Mark's life began to change in ways he never expected. News of the parade and the king's announcement spread throughout London and beyond. Mark became a local hero, inspiring not just children in his neighborhood, but people from all walks of life. Where once he had felt shy and uncertain, Mark now held his head high. His confidence grew, and he started dreaming even bigger. "If I can be an honorary royal guard," he told his mother one evening, "maybe I can do other impossible things too." Mark became a beacon of hope in his community. He visited schools, sharing his story and encouraging other children to follow their dreams, no matter what challenges they faced. He reminded them, "A brave heart can overcome anything." Years passed, and Mark's determination only deepened. When he grew older, he became an ambassador for inclusion, working closely with the Royal Guards. Together, they developed programs to ensure that children from all backgrounds and abilities felt seen, valued, and celebrated. During one of these events, Mark, now a confident young man, stood beside Captain James, who had become a high-ranking officer. James looked at Mark with pride and said, "You changed the guards forever, Mark, and you changed the king's heart too." Mark smiled, thinking of how far he'd come, from a boy dreaming at his window to a leader, inspiring others to dream. His legacy was clear. Bravery isn't about how you look or move. It's about how you believe in yourself and inspire others to do the same. This incredible story reminds us that kindness, courage, and determination can create real change. If you are inspired by Mark's journey, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories and click the notification bell to make sure you don't miss out. Share this story with your friends and loved ones to spread Mark's message of hope and bravery. Together, we can inspire more people to follow their dreams and make the world a kinder, braver place.